Welcome to the Mechanical PE Exam Prep Podcast, the podcast where I give mechanical engineers like you the tools and motivation to get your professional engineering license and take your career to the next level. In today's episode, we're going to go to the mailbag. We've got one technical question from an industry professional, and then we've got a few questions from candidates that are in the process right now. So let's jump in with the first question. Hi Dan, I have a question about critical spaces in power facilities. Any information you can provide is appreciated. In our HVAC standards that were written before I joined the company, we require N+1 redundancy, specifically 99% uptime, in control rooms and communications rooms. Due to budget constraints, upper management is questioning this requirement and its source. I know that the Uptime Institute is used for electrical equipment topologies, but I'm not sure if there's a specific source for HVAC. Would you happen to know a source that can be referenced for HVAC uptime? This is a great question, and I know it can be a sticky situation for facilities engineering professionals when there are cost considerations around achieving the level of uptime that's required, and those requirements are being questioned. And actually, you mentioned the Uptime Institute. They're a good resource not only for power systems, but for cooling systems as well. So if you go to their website, you'll find some good information about chillers and pumps and computer room air conditioners. So I think you've got the right resource already. Also, the tiers that Uptime defines are pretty useful for generating conversation within your organization about what the requirements ought to be. Although I will caution you, the devil is in the details, and what happens unfortunately is the folks in your position as facilities engineers are very interested in the details, and the details matter a lot. And management, because it's not their day-to-day role, they're focused more on high-level risks and opportunities. In this case, it looks like they're thinking about cost considerations. They may not have the time or the interest to get into those details, so you have a bit of an uphill battle here. The key is not to put yourself in a position where you feel like you have to defend the requirement, but rather that you're having an open discussion about what the requirements ought to be, and you're bringing the technical details and analysis to that discussion with the understanding that it can be as much of an art as a science. So for instance, if you're talking about the HVAC side for critical equipment rooms, you can put out the question, what does it truly mean to be N+1 or 2N or whatever the level of redundancy that you've typically built to in the past or that you think you might need to build to in the future? And you can take that piece by piece. For instance, on the air side, if you have individual units, they have their own fans and there's redundancy at the fan level, then you know you're going to get airflow, even if one fails. Then for the cooling source, if those are chilled water units and they're coming from the same chiller plant, then you need to have redundancy at the level of the chillers as well, and redundancy at the level of the pumps. If they're not chilled water units, if they're DX units and they're running their own refrigeration cycle, then you don't have to worry about that because each one has its own cycle. Another consideration is the power for mechanical systems. I know you already talked about having a handle on the electrical side, but all of these mechanical components have to be powered as well. So if they're on the same power supply and that's non-redundant, then you could have a potential risk there. There's something called a mechanical UPS system, which is specifically designed to power computer room air conditioners and other mechanical components. And then the last one, and potentially the most detailed, is the controls. If you have multiple units that are on the same control panel or relying on the same single points of failure within the BMS system, then that could easily lead to failures as well. So these are some of the things that you want to bring up, not that you want to push your problems over to management. They are your problems to solve, but that they need to have an understanding of the different failure modes, and you're going to be taking detailed notes during any of these discussions so that any decisions that are agreed upon are documented and summarized in an email, so that if in any case the standards that you've previously upheld are being relaxed, there's something clear to point back to say, hey, we used to make sure that all of this was N+1 or better, and now that's not happening. And it's not acceptable, in my opinion, to be in a rush and just use the tiers. I think the tiers, again, Uptime is fantastic for defining those because they're great for generating conversation about what level we want to come in at and what kinds of risks we want to protect against. But we can't just paint with a broad brush and say, okay, we're tier 3, and not necessarily recognize the implications of all of the small decisions that happen along the way that go along with that broad high-level decision. And if your management is open-minded, even though they're in the business of doing a budget exercise here and they probably want to reduce or relax some of the requirements, What you might find is if these conversations go well and they're productive, there may be an appetite for not only upholding, but in some cases improving the standard, which of course is easier to do when you're building new than if you're doing a retrofit to try to raise the standard. I guess my final point that I'll leave you with is that there's no right answer. It's different for every business. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And the conversations that happen internally are just as important as the actual decisions that get made and implemented. So this is a great question. I'm glad you asked it. It's definitely something I've spent a lot of time thinking about in my career. And I hope some of these thoughts were helpful. I'd love to hear how it all goes for you if you want to come back and share an update in the future. Second question. Hey Dan, hope you're doing well. I'm about a month out from my test and I'm getting pretty discouraged with how I'm performing with your practice exam problems. I went through all the regular course practice problems and flagged 6 to 8 from each section to do over again once I finished. Then I went through practice exam 1, and at first pass I got a 52 out of 80, and that's assuming I wouldn't have guessed any correct that I didn't get right in the first place. Now I'm on practice exam 2, and I've only gotten 8 out of the first 25 problems correct, and it's really discouraging. I feel like I understand most of the concepts, but either the language of the questions or where I'm supposed to go in the reference handbook get me tripped up. Over the course of my few months of studying, I've made about 150 note cards with not only the rule of thumb equations, but also language to notice in questions to steer me in the right direction for the reference book. I'm going to continue adding to these note cards as I continue to practice on exam 2. Do you have any sort of insight as to how else to approach my studying now that I'm in the home stretch with a month left? I have some travel plans coming up that I'm trying to juggle with studying too. I just have been working really hard the past few months for this, and I don't want to have wasted my studying just to not pass this test. I know I'm really struggling to get a grip on the engineering economics questions at the beginning, but I need to bank those points to be able to trip up on the tough questions later on. I also keep using the psych chart when I don't need to, or vice versa, so I'm trying to develop a better understanding of when to use the chart and when not to. Any help would be greatly appreciated. I just want to feel more prepared next month than I do right now, despite having studied for months. So I just want to start by acknowledging what you're dealing with right now. You're going through a period that's pretty discouraging, and I want you to know that you're not alone. It's very rare for a candidate to go through the entire study process and pass without feeling discouraged the way you do now at some point along the way, especially at the point that you're at now when you're about a month out. So I definitely want to first acknowledge that it doesn't feel very good, but it's pretty much par for the course. It's totally normal, and it's an under-discussed topic. Now, getting into some of the specifics of your question, as far as the note cards, it is a good way to catalog the key formulas and search terms. I actually give you in the program the key formulas and search terms that I used on printable PDFs so that you can use those as a starting point. But the reality is you're going to end up remembering about 90% of those search terms, and you'll probably remember a fair amount of the formulas as well. Of course, you don't need to memorize the formulas because you can use the search terms to find them in the reference handbook. But this remembering, I'm not a big fan of memorization. I kind of think it's a bad word. But when you repeat the problems, right, when you get enough repetition on a wide enough variety of problems, you end up remembering these phrases and you end up becoming very efficient at using the reference handbook. And again, it's not going to be 100%, but the other 10% you can probably figure out on the spot. And as long as you're not spending too much time on every problem, then it's okay if you need to spend a little extra on some of the problems. You'll actually have plenty of time on the exam if you're well prepared. But stepping back a bit and kind of coming at what your question is dealing with more generally, I think what's missing from what's giving you that feeling of being prepared that you're really looking for is the ability to quickly size up a new problem and build a solution roadmap. That's usually what people mean when they talk about feeling prepared. They want to know that they can get a new problem and right away they can look at the given information, figure out what it all means, and chart a course to being able to solve. That's what you want to feel like you're prepared. And something I've talked about in previous podcasts is that every problem has two parts. There's the divergent part, or what I like to call the creative part at the beginning, and then there's the convergent part at the end. So the divergent part at the beginning is something that gets easier with experience. I'm talking about reading the problem, understanding what it's driving at, thinking through what equations and formulas you're going to need, gathering information from the reference handbook, deciding what's extra information that you don't need to use, and what you're going to do, creating that roadmap, step 1, step 2, step 3, and then I'm going to get my answer. The process of putting that together can be pretty frustrating at the beginning because you don't know where to start. You're just looking at a problem and you're like, oh my God, there's so much here. I don't even know where to begin. You don't know what you don't know. Now, when you get further along in your process, because you've been doing this for a few months, you're kind of in a different place than you were at the beginning, you actually know quite a bit. You have most of the links in the chain to create that solution roadmap, but maybe you don't have all of them. So there's one piece missing that's preventing you from putting it all together. At this point, the primary purpose of studying is to rehearse this part of the problem-solving process and to fill in those gaps. We're finding those missing links to the chain one by one and making sure that you have those. And we're doing that until all the concepts connect in your mind. Once we achieve this, you'll have what I would call engineering fluency. If we were learning a language instead of studying for an engineering exam, we would have vocabulary words, which are the building blocks. We put those words together to make sentences, but making sentences isn't enough. What we really want to achieve is we want to get our ideas across to another person. So we've got to write in a manner that actually allows us to communicate. That's what it means to be fluent. It's the same thing in engineering. We're going to find these formulas, which are just building blocks. Really, what we're after is the underlying concept that that formula describes. And even that isn't enough. We need to be able to recognize that that concept is in play and take it and use it and apply it to a practical situation. Most PE exam problems are practical situations. So that's what it means to be fluent, and that's all about the first part of solving a problem. The second part of solving a problem is the convergent part. It's the plug and chug part, putting the numbers in your calculator, getting an answer, checking the units, sense checking the answer before making a final selection. And this part of the solution process is comparatively trivial on the PE because the first part is much harder to become good at. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'll contrast this with the FE where the questions are not as deep. There's a wide breadth of what you need to know for the FE, but there's a lot of plug and chug type questions. You can pass the FE without having to think incredibly deeply. The PE forces you to think deeply, and it's tough, but it's fair. And the last point that I can offer you here, and hopefully this is helpful, is that you don't have to worry too much about grading yourself on practice exams. Even at this late stage, I know you're a month away, I still want you to focus more on finding and closing the gaps, the links in the chain like we talked about before, so that if you were to encounter a similar problem later, you could successfully solve it confidently and efficiently. If you're in your final month and you're still finding gaps, that's a good thing. That means you won't have to find them on your exam day. I know it's not the best feeling to discover that you have further to go, but the good news is that you still have time to move the needle. And you should expect to work hard. I know you've already been working hard for months, but you should still expect to work hard over these next few weeks with the understanding that a certain amount of self-doubt is unavoidable. But the best remedy to that is to keep chipping away and trusting the process. Worrying only gets you closer to the goal if it's uncomfortable enough that it causes you to put in more effort. Otherwise, if you're just worrying and becoming anxious and swirling in that emotion, then it's actually distracting, and that's going to have a negative impact on your performance, not only on the exam, but also when you come to your study sessions. So if you find yourself wallowing in anxiety, the best antidote to that day after day is to just get in solid study sessions today, tomorrow, the next day, the next day. And if you do that, then you'll know that you're giving it everything you've got. You've done everything in your power to pass. And when you approach it that way and you trust the process, you will pass. So I hope that helps, and I look forward to hearing how it goes for you. Third question. Hi, Dan. Hope all is well with you. With the HVAC bundle, I'm near the finish line, taking the practice test soon, but I feel like I have really bad test-taking anxiety. Do you have any tips about how to relieve that and how to stay focused? It's hard for me to just jump in and do them. Also, tips on how to stay in game mode for the 2 4-hour blocks would be greatly appreciated. Many thanks. So I want to answer your question with a question here, which is, are we talking about the actual exam, or are we talking about doing a study simulation on the practice exams when it comes to anxiety? Because if you have anxiety about the actual exam, I would view that as a positive. In fact, sometimes anxiety is really 2 emotions at the same time. It's worry that it won't go your way, but it's also excitement that you have the opportunity to show what you know. And I think when we peel back the layers and recognize that both of those emotions are there, we can get excited about the possibility of getting this thing done and passing, and there's going to be relief on the other side of that. So that's a good thing to maybe take away and do some journaling or talk to a close friend or family member to just kind of work through what's going on there and separate out the emotion from what you need to do so that you can focus. If we're talking about being anxious about practice exams, that's a bit of a different story, because that means probably what's happening is that we're raising the stakes on the practice higher than they should be. Practice is just practice. It doesn't count. So we have to remind ourselves that Even though the PE is important and it's an important goal for you, we want to acknowledge that, the stakes are quite low for practice. One of the things that helps me is just remembering that being nervous means that I care. And that's a good thing if you can then channel that toward doing the work. On a more tactical level, as far as the 4-hour blocks, you can break it up into smaller chunks. You can do 4 2-hour blocks or even 8 1-hour blocks. I know there's a lot of purists out there that think it's really important to do a full 8-hour simulation. They'll do a 4-hour block in the morning and then take lunch and then do another 4-hour block in the afternoon. And if you have the appetite for doing that, you're welcome to, but I don't think that that's necessarily critical. I think it's more important that you go deep and learn from these problems as much as you can. And there's not really a lot of value in making yourself super tired and stressed. I know you're probably conscious of this endurance component that you need to build up in time for the exam. But if you're studying every day and you're putting in 1 or 2 hour sessions, then you're already developing that endurance. To use a marathon analogy, a marathon runner doesn't have to run 26.2 miles before the actual race. They very often don't. They do a lot of long runs. They run a lot of 6, 8, 10-mile runs, sometimes 12 or 15, and maybe even some longer ones, but they don't do 100% of the distance before the actual event. And it's the same here. You don't have to worry that you're not going to have enough endurance to get through an 8-hour day, because the reality is you're not going to have time to be nervous when you're out there. You're going to be busy solving engineering problems. You're going to be showing what you know, and that's going to occupy your mind. And one more thing to remember, I know this ties into the previous question, you're not done studying. I know you're getting closer to the end, but you don't need to be a finished product yet. So if you're taking practice exams in your final month, these practice tests are still part of your study process. They're not the exam. So don't expect perfection. Use these additional problems to make further progress, knowing that you're closing gaps and you're getting closer. So keep up the good work. And the fourth and final question, hey Dan, hope you're doing well. I've been grinding like crazy these last couple weeks doing your practice exams over again, as well as the NC's practice exam. And I'm now working on another exam that I got from a coworker. Still not doing great overall on these exams, but for the most part, I'm able to understand the solutions and continue to make flashcards of question language that should lead to a specific roadmap. All that said, the exams have a lot more word-based questions about situations and what equipment to use or what scenario is most appropriate rather than 80 calculation-based problems. Do you have any insight for how to prepare for those kinds of problems? I'm trying my best to stay positive, but I'm just so tired of investing 4 to 5 hours every day after work on this material just to continually get problems wrong. It's just a really discouraging feeling. Only 10 days away from my exam. Any insight would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for your time as always. So definitely staying on the same theme as the last two questions. Again, it is a common feeling as hardworking candidates like you are approaching the big day to feel the way you feel. And you're even closer being just 10 days out. So at the end, it really comes down to trusting the process and believing that your efforts will take you across the finish line. You're working incredibly hard. You're putting in 4 to 5 hours a day. So there's no doubt that the hard work is there. You really just need that reassurance to kind of ease your mind. So remember that many hundreds of candidates have used the program that you're in and probably some of the same outside materials that you're using to supplement it. And they have passed the mechanical PE exam before you at a very high rate. So the amount of time and energy that you're committing is admirable, and it's more than sufficient to succeed here. And this is something that I talked about on a previous podcast with a candidate after he passed. You're never going to be 100% confident, and you have to be okay with that. And the good news for you is that you only have to grind for another week. So I want you to continue to work hard. You're doing the right work in the right way. You're repeating problems. You're trying to close gaps, and you should plan on doing that for another 7 days. But at the end, take the last couple days off, get some rest, take care of yourself. There's no need to study in the last 48 hours. You've done enough by then. You haven't seen it all, but you've seen enough. And as far as which problems are most relevant and how to deal with some of those conceptual questions, my approach has always been to cover the concepts in the context of a calculation problem. So you'll notice that a lot of my problems are calculation-based, but there's multiple concepts layered into those problems. So you're getting both at the same time. And the program in general reflects the type of studying that I personally found most beneficial when I was going through the process. If something tricked me up, if something confused me, if I had to work hard to get something through my head, then I absolutely made sure that if that topic was important, that's going to find its way into the program. So if you go through it diligently, which it sounds like you are, and you leave no stone unturned, you're going to get everything that you need here. And obviously that's an expression of my opinion about the PE exam and what kinds of things you should expect to find on there, I'm actually glad to hear that you're incorporating some other resources to inject the opinions of others too. That gives you even more coverage. But I also want to let you know that even if you were to consume everything that's out there, there's always going to be a handful of problems on your exam that will seem foreign and have the potential to throw you off. And the candidates that come up short are the ones that expect perfection, and they get rattled when this happens on the exam, and it always happens. There's always one or two problems that throw you for a loop. So not if, but when that happens, how are you going to respond to it? You're going to flag it, you're going to move on, you're going to come back to it later, and you're not going to get into a vicious cycle where you're wasting time thinking about this one problem that you may or may not be able to figure out when there's lots of other problems that represent an opportunity for you to show what you know and ultimately succeed at this thing. So stay flexible. What bends will not break. And again, like my answer to the last question, the way to stay positive in these last 10 days as you're studying is to remind yourself that every time you get a problem wrong, even at this late stage, that means you're finding a hole in your knowledge before the exam. You're finding a link in the chain that's missing that needs to be there. And that is the best possible time to find it. Finding it now is fantastic. Finding out on the exam is a problem. So finish strong. You're at mile 23 of the marathon now, so don't stop running even though it hurts, and it's going to feel great when you get to that finish line. Looking forward to hearing how it goes for you. So that's going to do it for this mailbag episode. Really enjoyed some of the common themes in this one and dealing with lulls in motivation that tend to happen when you're working hard and you're getting closer to your exam. So if that's you and these questions resonated, just know that you're not alone. And work hard. It's not forever. You're going to get it done. And it's going to feel like a great accomplishment when you get to the other side. Thanks for listening to the Mechanical PE Exam Prep Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review to help other engineers find the podcast. And if you're looking for a program that will help you pass the PE exam, check out the full access bundle available at mechanicalpeexamprep.com. And feel free to reach out with any questions. I would be honored to be your guide on the journey to becoming a professional engineer.